Always curious, Professor George Washington Carver committed his life to scholarship, community, and the integration of his Christian faith with higher education. It's in this spirit we welcome you to Carver Classrooms. Led by a diverse set of faculty guides, this series will explore contemporary questions at the crossroads of knowledge, faith, and wonder. These nationally recognized teachers are both practicing Christians and respected academics, working at the highest levels of education around the country. We hope this series can be an encouragement. In our time together, we aim to translate complex issues into usable Christian frameworks for everyday life and ministry. My name is John Hendricks. I invite you to join us as we explore God's gift of knowledge and draw aside the curtain together.
Hi, my name is Kristen Van Engen. I'm a professor of linguistics and psychological and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. In these videos, I'm going to give you a little taste of what linguistics is. So we'll start in the first video with a little bit about what it is that we care about as linguists and why you might care as well. In the second video, we'll talk about terms like language and dialect and accent and how we can use those well and understand them better. In the third video, I'm going to talk about the way in which language varies, even within a single language, all the different variation that we see. And then in the fourth video, we'll talk a bit about what happens when we communicate in a second language. Language is a fundamental part of being human. One of the most important ways we express ourselves, both in terms of what we say and in terms of how we say it. It allows us to communicate and therefore connects us to one another, but all too often, it also divides us. And this is not just because we miscommunicate or harm each other with what we say. It's also because we often don't have a great understanding of why people speak the way they do, and we end up making judgments or incorrect assumptions about people who sound different from us. As a linguist, I firmly believe the world would be a better place if everyone knew a little bit more about my field of study. And my hope is that by understanding a little more about human language, you'll be better able to understand the people you lead and serve, and be better equipped to do redemptive work in places where linguistic differences can lead to brokenness. To get us started, I want to look at the biblical creation story and this really fascinating tidbit about language in Genesis 2. So this is verse 19. The Lord God has just created all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the air, and he brings them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. So this is a really fascinating moment, right? Language, of course, it's part of God's creation. It's also part of humanity's creative endowment and something that God is interested in. God gives the man, the license to name the creatures and is going to use whatever name he calls them. So as a linguist, I'm interested in better understanding this aspect of creation. But before we go too much farther, I think it's important to tell you a little more about what a linguist is and is not. So linguists are people who pursue the scientific study of human language. This can mean documenting languages, can mean developing theories about how individual languages or human language as a whole works, and it can mean running experiments to test those theories and to better understand the way humans both perceive language and produce it. What we are not, necessarily at least, are polyglots. So a lot of people hear the word linguist and they're like, oh, how many languages do you speak? Lots of people who speak lots of languages get interested in linguistics, or people who are interested in linguistics might want to study other languages. So there are plenty of multilingual linguists out there, but it's not a requirement that you be multilingual, and I certainly am not. The other thing that's important to know about linguists is that we are not grammar sticklers. So sometimes when people hear that I'm a linguist, they say something like, ooh, I better watch what I say around you. But in fact, the opposite is true. Linguists are truly interested in the way language is used naturally. And a lot of the rules that you've learned about how to speak are just that. They're rules that somebody decided should apply for proper usage that aren't necessarily rooted in the way language really works. So one example of this is the split infinitive. So lots of English speakers have been taught to never split an infinitive. Here's the thing, I just did it. Did you notice? Maybe? Maybe not, because really splitting infinitives in English is incredibly natural. It's common. It's been going on for hundreds of years. The rule against splitting infinitives comes from this fascination with Latin and the belief that Latin doesn't split infinitives, so as English speakers, we shouldn't split infinitives. The thing is, Latin doesn't split infinitives because the infinitive form is one word in Latin. So nope, no infinitives get split in Latin. So this rule against splitting infinitives is really social convention. It's not a linguistic necessity. It's a social convention that prohibits using these in English. This kind of rule is what we linguists call a prescriptive rule. That's a rule about how language should be used based on somebody's idea about that. And that's usually based on social norms that come from the members of society that have more power to decide that their way should be the right way. We are not interested in these rules as linguists. Instead, we're interested in describing language as it's used naturally. And what we really want to understand is what we call the mental grammar. So that's the rules in the minds of speakers that dictate the way language is used. Those rules are typically not taught explicitly, like it's not something your teacher taught you, because they are simply the ones that native speakers are going to follow without even realizing it. So for example, in English, it would be strange to say, I saw the house red today, because English has what we call prenominal modification. Adjectives come before the nouns they modify. Lots of other languages do it the other way around, right? But this isn't a rule that anybody had to drill into you as an English speaker, because English-speaking kids figure it out quickly on their own and follow that rule without thinking about it. And this is the kind of implicit knowledge that exists at all levels of linguistic structure. So from the order of words in a sentence, like that example, to the way individual speech sounds are produced. So to give you an example of that, the plural S in English, right? We want to take a singular noun, turn it into plural, we throw an S on, right? At least that's what we do when we write it. The thing is, when you produce that in speech, the way you produce that sound actually depends on what word you just put that S onto. So if you have a cat and you want to refer to more than one, you put a S sound, cats, right? But if you have one dog and you want to refer to two, you have to put a Z sound, or most speakers will do that naturally. Nobody taught you that S, it's a S following a voiceless sound, but it's a Z if it follows a voiced sound. This is one of these rules that as English speakers, you're following it, you're applying it naturally without ever thinking about it at all. So a lot of the knowledge we have about our own languages is implicit. Unless we take a linguistics class, we may never be aware of the rules that we're following. We also don't always recognize that people who speak differently from us are also following those same kind of implicit linguistic rules in the way they speak. They just differ from the ones that we follow. We'll talk more about these differences in some of the videos that follow. But to wrap this one up, I just want to remind you of sort of my key points. First, language is a fascinating aspect of God's creation and one that even God is interested in and curious about. Linguistics as a discipline is the scientific study of human language. And as linguists, we're primarily interested in understanding how language works by studying the knowledge that native speakers have, regardless of whether their language usage matches up to the norms of society. And finally, a lot of that knowledge is implicit. That is, you don't know a lot about the things you know about the languages that you speak. And this can affect the way we perceive and treat people who speak differently from us. I hope you've enjoyed this very brief introduction to what linguistics is, and that you'll join me for the next video in which we'll go over really specifically what do we mean when we call something a language or a dialect or an accent.